He woke up to the soft sound of birds outside his window, the sunlight slipping through the blinds and warming the small living room where he had spent most of his evenings reading or listening to music. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, and the faint traces of the dinner he had cooked the night before. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of morning that made him feel like life was simple, like things were under control. He sat on the edge of the bed, stretching slowly, feeling the comfort of the ordinary day ahead. Most people who passed by his house would have assumed he led a regular, unremarkable life. A man content with his daily routines and the calm of his neighborhood. He got up, put on a simple shirt and worn jeans, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The routine was comforting. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the soft hum of the coffee machine, the way the sunlight glinted off the counter. Even though he lived alone, he felt at home in these small rituals. He liked the quiet moments before the city fully woke, before the hustle of work and errands began. He moved with a calm, measured energy that made even the simplest tasks seem smooth and effortless. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced around the room, his eyes catching the edges of framed photos he had kept tucked away on a shelf. Some were of distant places, landscapes that looked wild and remote. Others showed men and women in uniforms, faces serious, eyes sharp, bodies poised for action. He didn't think about them much anymore, but sometimes he allowed himself a moment to remember. There was pride in those memories, yes, but also a certain weight. Memories that reminded him of a different life, one that demanded discipline, attention, and the ability to make decisions in the most impossible situations. He didn't share these stories with anyone. He had no reason to. People liked him as he was now, calm, approachable, polite. The man who mowed his lawn greeted neighbors and shopped for groceries without drawing attention. After breakfast, he stepped outside for a brief walk. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with trees, some of which had begun to shed their leaves as autumn crept closer. He nodded to a neighbor watering her flowers, exchanged brief greetings with another as he passed. It was normal, comfortable, ordinary, and yet, even in the midst of this peaceful morning, he noticed subtle things. A car parked too long at the corner, the faint echo of a shout from far down the street the night before. He didn't react, didn't show concern, but his mind cataloged everything. Observation had been second nature to him for years. He had learned to notice details that most people missed, to read situations before they escalated. By mid-morning, he was back home, tidying the small apartment and preparing for the workday. He worked remotely for a company that valued diligence and reliability. His colleagues knew him as quiet, thoughtful, and thorough, but no one suspected the depth of his past. He typed emails efficiently, scheduled calls, and completed tasks with a precision that made him a model employee. At lunch, he prepared a simple meal, eating slowly and thoughtfully, savoring the flavors. There was a rhythm to his day that grounded him, that reminded him he could enjoy the simple things after years of chaos and high stakes. Yet outside his doors, not everyone in the neighborhood shared the same sense of peace. He had noticed certain people over the past few months, men and women whose attitudes carried tension and hostility, whose presence often made neighbors uncomfortable. They had been causing minor troubles at first, slurs shouted from passing cars, trash thrown onto lawns, graffiti painted on fences, small acts but persistent. They were a gang of racists who seemed to thrive on intimidation and fear. Most residents avoided them, hoping they would eventually move on. He didn't show concern, didn't confront them. He had lived with threats and danger before. He knew when to act and when to wait. That afternoon, as he returned from a short walk to the corner store, he noticed more signs that something was brewing. Trash bins had been overturned at the neighboring house, windows were splattered with paint, and a faint, malicious message was scratched into a fence. Words meant to provoke, to instill fear. Most people would have panicked, called the authorities, or locked themselves away. He stood silently, observing the damage, noting small details, the direction of footprints, the pattern of the paint splatters, the height at which the letters were scrawled. It was not fear that guided him, it was recognition. He understood behavior patterns. He understood threats, and he understood that this was the beginning, not the end. The evening arrived quietly. He cooked dinner, ate in silence, and washed the dishes. The radio played softly in the background, but he barely listened. His thoughts were elsewhere, circling around possibilities, contingencies, and strategies. He thought about his training, about the skills he had honed over years in situations most civilians could never imagine. He remembered late nights in foreign lands, missions that required him to remain invisible, to observe, and to act with precision when the moment demanded it. Those memories were never far from his mind, though they rarely surfaced in daily life. Tonight, however, they were present, like quiet whispers reminding him that he was not the man the gang expected him to be. Later, as darkness fell, he stepped outside to check the perimeter of his property. Streetlights flickered along the quiet street, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and bend. He moved with deliberate care, scanning the environment, noticing sounds others would miss. A distant engine, the faint scrape of shoes on pavement, a shadow that shifted against a wall. It was instinctive, trained, automatic. The world looked different to him, sharper, more precise. Most people saw a quiet street. He saw the possibilities, the threats, the patterns. He returned inside and locked the doors, double-checking the windows. He didn't need to panic. He had control. He prepared for a quiet night, yet part of him remained alert, aware that those outside would not stop unless something changed. He spent the rest of the evening reading, letting the calm settle over him, though beneath the surface every muscle and mind fiber was prepared for action. Sleep eventually came, though it was light, watchful, and full of awareness. That night, somewhere beyond the streetlights and quiet houses, the gang gathered, unaware of the presence of someone who had lived a life very different from theirs. They were loud, brash, and reckless, their arrogance blinding them to the reality that the man they mocked and planned to intimidate had seen far worse, had faced far greater threats, and had survived. They thought he was just another quiet resident, someone to scare and provoke. They were wrong. The morning came again, bright and serene, and he moved through his morning routine with the same calm precision. Coffee, breakfast, a brief walk, a nod to neighbors. But now his awareness was heightened. He watched quietly without alerting anyone. He remembered the graffiti, the overturned trash, the taunts, and he remembered the lessons of patience, strategy, and observation he had learned over years of training and missions. He did not fear what was coming. He did not underestimate it. He only prepared, knowing that the world was about to reveal itself in a way that would change everything for those who had assumed he was just ordinary. And so, life continued, peaceful on the surface but layered with tension beneath. The quiet man who smiled at neighbors, who brewed coffee and tended his home, carried within him the knowledge, skill, and readiness of a life far beyond what anyone could imagine. For now he moved among ordinary days, a figure of calm, of normalcy, but he was ready, and soon the world outside his doors would learn that appearances could be deceiving, and that the quietest man often held the greatest power. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that seems to stretch endlessly, making every small sound sharper and more noticeable. Inside his home, he moved with the same calm precision that had marked his days. The apartment was tidy, every object in its place, every corner familiar and well-maintained. He lit a small lamp in the living room, the soft glow casting warm shadows on the walls. Outside, the street seemed peaceful, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind the only sign of life. He sat down in his favorite chair and opened a book, but his mind was not fully on the words. There was an unease lingering in the air, something subtle that made him more alert than usual. Over the past few weeks, the disturbances in the neighborhood had grown more bold, more aggressive. Trash bins overturned, graffiti scrawled in hateful messages, cars honking and shouting insults late at night. Most people would have called the police, waited for help, and tried to ignore it. He did not react that way. He watched, observed, and waited. He knew that with patience and attention, even the smallest clues could reveal the intentions of those who thought they were clever. As he set the book aside, a faint sound reached his ears. At first he thought it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the window. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be random. He held his breath and listened, quiet as a shadow, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. There it was again. A soft scraping, a faint movement near the edge of the property. Most people would have dismissed it or panicked. He stood slowly, moving toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The street was empty, yet his instincts told him that something was off. He could feel the tension, the small disruptions that revealed more than the eye could see. Then, just beyond the corner of his home, he saw them, A group of men, moving with a reckless confidence, confident in their ability to intimidate and terrorize. Their faces were partially covered, their movements clumsy but aggressive. They carried spray paint, bats, and other objects meant to damage and scare. They had no idea he was watching, that he had already noted the patterns of their movements, the direction they approached from, the way they communicated with small, silent signals among themselves. He stepped back from the window, not with fear but with calculation. He did not panic. Panic was useless. What mattered was awareness, strategy, and timing. He moved to the bedroom, his movements quiet, practiced as if rehearsed countless times. He reached a small drawer and opened it briefly, just to touch the tools he kept there. They were not weapons in the conventional sense, but they were extensions of his experience, of the years he had spent learning how to protect, observe, and act when the situation demanded it. The gang reached his house, laughing and shouting, clearly expecting to frighten whoever lived inside. They did not consider that he was no ordinary man. They did not know that behind the calm exterior was someone who had seen danger up close, who had survived situations where every second counted, and who understood the weaknesses of people driven by arrogance and hate. He stayed silent, moving from room to room, watching as they broke windows and forced doors. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the apartment, but he did not flinch. Instead, he noted everything: the tools they used, the order in which they moved, the carelessness in their steps. They thought they were in control. They thought this was intimidation, that he would cower and call for help. They were wrong. One of the men stepped inside the living room, swinging a bat at furniture, laughing at the mess he was creating. Another scrawled a hateful message on the wall. Their actions were loud, chaotic, but in their noise was a pattern that he had already begun to understand. He memorized it, storing every detail in his mind: the height of the graffiti, the direction of the footprints, the sounds of movement in relation to each object in the room. Then he acted, quietly, deliberately. He did not confront them immediately. There was no need for rash action. He moved through the apartment like a shadow, positioning himself in ways that gave him a full view without being seen. His breathing was calm, controlled. His mind was calculating, considering the most effective way to end this intrusion, without putting himself in unnecessary danger. The gang continued, unaware of his presence. One man, emboldened, moved closer to the bedroom, the door slightly ajar. That small movement was all he needed. He stepped out from the shadows, his voice low but firm, startling the intruder. "Leave." It was not a shout. It was not a threat. It was a command, calm and unwavering. The man froze, confusion and fear flickering across his face. The others turned, realizing too late that they were not dealing with a frightened homeowner. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Confidence turned to hesitation, arrogance to doubt. The intruder stumbled backward, glancing at his companions, who were now trying to gauge what had happened. He did not attack. He did not escalate unnecessarily. He simply revealed, through posture, presence, and quiet authority, that he was not someone to be trifled with. Every movement was precise, controlled, deliberate. He had done this before, not in homes like this, but in far more dangerous environments where mistakes were costly and lives were on the line. The gang's lack of awareness had brought them into his space, and now they realized they had miscalculated. As they hesitated, he allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. These were ordinary men, driven by fear, ignorance, and hate, thinking that chaos and intimidation could make them powerful. They did not understand discipline, focus, or the kind of awareness that came from years of training and survival. They had entered a space where their usual tactics would not work, and they were beginning to feel it. Outside, a neighbor looked from a distance, alarmed at the noise. But even from afar, they could not understand what was happening. To them, it looked like a break-in, a violent intrusion. They could not see the calm and controlled figure inside, observing, calculating, and managing the situation with precision that no ordinary civilian could muster. He moved again, quietly positioning himself to guide them out. No unnecessary confrontation, no reckless action, just observation, strategy, and control. The intruders started to retreat, unsure, hesitant, sensing that they were no longer in charge. He stayed calm, silent, letting the tension build until their fear became undeniable. Slowly, they backed out, leaving his apartment, leaving behind the evidence of their arrogance, their ignorance. Once the last of them had gone, he waited, ensuring that they had truly left. He did not rush to celebrate or act impulsively. Instead, he walked through his home, checking every corner, noting the minor damages, the signs of intrusion, and the lessons from their behavior. Every detail was a record, stored in his mind for later use, in case they returned or escalated. After ensuring his home was secure, he sat down again in the living room, the lamp casting a warm glow, the night returning to quiet. He took a deep breath, allowing the tension to leave his body. Outside, the street was calm once more, the earlier chaos now replaced by silence. But he remained alert, awake, aware of the lessons the night had provided. He understood the nature of those who had tried to intimidate him, and he knew that their arrogance had left them exposed. As he prepared for bed, he thought about the world outside his doors. Most people would never understand the balance between calm observation and decisive action, the quiet power of awareness and preparedness. He had lived it, breathed it, and relied on it. And tonight had been a reminder that appearances were deceiving, that ordinary days could hide extraordinary capability. He lay down, letting the calm return, though his mind remained sharp. Sleep came slowly, light and alert, a watchfulness ingrained by years of experience. Tomorrow he would go about his routine as he always had, but the world would be different now. The gang had learned, in their own way, that they had underestimated the man they had tried to intimidate. They had seen a glimpse of a reality they were not prepared for, and the lesson would not be forgotten. And so, the quiet man returned to his normal life, the surface calm of breakfast, coffee, and work routines hiding the intense awareness and readiness that had kept him safe. The neighborhood remained quiet, the streets calm, but beneath the surface vigilance and skill had prevailed. The break-in had ended, not with chaos but with control, precision, and a reminder that true strength was not always visible. He knew that this was only the beginning, that threats could return and that vigilance was never ending. But he was ready, prepared, and aware, a man who had lived a life that taught him the value of patience, observation, and strategy. And as the night faded into morning, he remained calm, collected, and quietly unstoppable. The morning after the break-in was calm, almost eerily so. The sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, spilling golden light across lawns and streets. To most people it looked like any other day, quiet and peaceful. But for him it was a day for careful observation. He moved through his apartment with the same deliberate rhythm he always did, brewing coffee, preparing a simple breakfast, and tidying the rooms. Everything looked normal, orderly, calm, and yet underneath that calm his mind was alert, cataloging every detail from the previous night. He thought about the gang, their arrogance, their mistakes. They had assumed he was just another man, someone easy to intimidate, someone who would be frightened and overpowered. But they had underestimated him. That mistake would not be repeated. He noted the patterns in their behavior, the sloppy coordination, and the overconfidence that had guided their actions. It was not just the physical intrusion that concerned him. It was the mindset behind it. People who act out of arrogance and hatred rarely think ahead. That made them predictable. Across town, the gang was already gathering, meeting in a small, cluttered garage that smelled of gasoline and old paint. Their faces were tense, voices tight with confusion and frustration. None of them had expected resistance. They thought the man would panic, call the police, and remain a passive victim. Instead, he had observed, controlled, and confronted them in a way that left them shaken. "I don't get it," one of them said, pacing. "He didn't even yell, didn't even run, he just stood there." "Yeah," another replied. "It was like he knew everything we were going to do before we did it." Their discussion was full of uncertainty, something unfamiliar to them. They were used to being in control, used to instilling fear and watching it work instantly. But that night, fear had bounced back at them in a way they could not explain. They had left his apartment feeling uneasy, their bravado shaken. And now, for the first time, they realized that not all their victims would be weak. Not all the people they targeted would be defenseless. Meanwhile, he went about his day as usual. He walked the streets with casual steps, exchanged greetings with neighbors, and ran errands. Everything appeared normal, yet every movement was intentional. His eyes scanned every angle, every passerby, every vehicle that lingered too long or moved too slowly. He noticed small things others would miss. A car parked for too long at the corner, a shadow moving behind a fence, the sound of footsteps that did not belong. His awareness was not driven by fear. It was driven by preparation and foresight. The gang, frustrated and confused, decided to regroup and plan. They assumed the man had retreated, that he was scared, and that they could try again. But their arrogance blinded them to the reality that he had already anticipated this. He had observed their movements, recorded their patterns, and understood their weaknesses. They had no idea that the calm man they thought they could intimidate was already several steps ahead. That evening, as the sun began to set, he prepared his apartment with subtle adjustments. Nothing drastic, nothing that would alert a casual observer, but small measures that increased his awareness and control. He checked the doors and windows, ensuring that each lock was secure and functional. He rearranged furniture slightly, creating clear lines of sight, and noted where shadows fell with the fading light. He moved quietly, efficiently, with the same calm that had always defined him. Outside, the gang approached again, trying to maintain their usual bravado. They were emboldened by the thought that perhaps this time he would not confront them, that they could intimidate him into silence. But as they reached his property, they noticed something different. The air around the house felt different, charged with a presence they could not identify. Something about the way the lights were positioned, the way the windows reflected, made them hesitate. The confidence that had carried them before wavered. Inside, he watched from a distance. He could hear their movements, their whispers, the nervousness creeping into their voices. He did not rush. He allowed them to feel the weight of uncertainty, to experience the subtle fear that came from not knowing what they were up against. He knew that true power often lay not in immediate confrontation, but in control, in patience, in the ability to shape the situation without revealing all of oneself. One of the gang members moved closer to a side window, attempting to peer inside. He adjusted his position, remained unseen, and observed. The man's movements were sloppy, his overconfidence betraying him. He had seen this many times before. People who thought themselves clever only to reveal their weakness through small, careless details. With quiet precision, he made a slight sound in another part of the apartment. The man jumped, startled, and stumbled back. The others noticed and exchanged uncertain glances. Confidence turned to doubt. They began whispering, questioning whether their target was really as passive as they had assumed. Their fear, small but growing, was exactly what he wanted. He did not need to act aggressively. The knowledge that he was not ordinary, that he was alert and aware, was enough to unbalance them for hours. They lingered outside, trying to gauge his reactions, trying to decide if they should retreat or escalate. He remained calm, controlled, watching from shadows, noting every word, every movement. He understood their patterns, their communication, their thought process. He had lived in situations far more dangerous than this, situations where hesitation could cost lives. And he knew that tonight, observation alone would begin to turn the tide. He allowed himself a brief reflection, thinking about the contrast between his current life and the life he had once led. Back then, every action had consequences far more severe. Every decision had to be precise, every movement calculated. That training, those years of discipline and experience, were not wasted. They were now his edge in a world where ordinary men underestimated him. The gang, growing more agitated, decided to leave some messages in their usual way: graffiti, trash, and other signs meant to provoke. But even these acts intended to intimidate were now under his watchful eye. He anticipated their methods, adjusted his surroundings, and prepared for whatever they might attempt next. It was not about revenge, it was about control, about demonstrating that the arrogance of others could not dictate his life. By late night, the gang finally retreated, their confidence shaken, their plans disrupted. They had expected fear, compliance, and chaos. Instead, they had encountered calm, awareness, and subtle power. They had seen enough to know that this man was not ordinary, that he was someone whose skills and experience far exceeded what they had imagined. He did not celebrate, did not gloat. Instead, he moved through his apartment, checking doors and windows, noting small signs that could indicate future attempts. He reflected on what had happened, analyzing their mistakes, their weaknesses, and the lessons he could take from their behavior. Every detail was stored in his mind, a mental record for the days to come. The neighborhood remained quiet, unaware of the tension that had played out in that small apartment. To them, it was simply another night, peaceful and uneventful. But inside, The man had already begun preparing, already thinking ahead, already turning the night's events into knowledge and strategy. He understood that appearances were deceptive and that true control was not about showing force immediately, but about being ready, being aware, and knowing how to act when the time was right. As the hours passed, he allowed himself a few moments of rest, sitting quietly with a cup of tea, reflecting on the calm that could be maintained even in the presence of danger. The world outside might never understand the balance between observation and action, between patience and decisiveness. But he did, and that knowledge, that experience, gave him power beyond what most people could imagine. He lay down finally, letting the night carry him toward sleep, though it was a light, alert sleep. His mind remained active, processing the events of the day, planning for the unknown future. He knew the gang might return, that threats could escalate, but he was ready, prepared, and aware. He was calm, precise, and in control. The morning would come again, bright and ordinary to the casual observer. But for him, it would be another opportunity to observe, to prepare, and to remain a step ahead. The gang had learned something important. The man they thought they could scare was not afraid, was not ordinary, and was far more dangerous than they could ever imagine, and so, life continued outwardly unchanged, quietly ordinary but layered with awareness, vigilance, and quiet strength. The calm man who brewed coffee, walked the streets, and greeted neighbors had revealed only a glimpse of what he was capable of. The rest remained hidden, silent, and ready, waiting for the moment when the situation demanded action. The night had ended with his quiet victory, not in confrontation or chaos, but in subtle control and awareness, and that was enough. The gang had discovered, in their own way, that appearances could be deceiving, that arrogance could blind, and that some people were far more capable than they seemed. He closed his eyes, letting the calm settle, the quiet of his apartment wrapping around him like a shield. Outside, the neighborhood slept, unaware of the tension, unaware of the lessons learned, unaware of the quiet force that remained vigilant in their midst. Inside, he rested, prepared, and observed, a man whose life had taught him that control, patience, and awareness were the greatest strengths of all. The next few days were quiet on the surface. The sun rose and set, neighbors went about their routines, and the streets appeared calm. But he knew better. Calm could be deceiving, and arrogance could be dangerous. The gang that had tried to intimidate him still lingered in his mind, their faces, voices, and careless movements recorded in every detail. He did not act out of anger or revenge. He acted out of precision, awareness, and the need to ensure that such recklessness would not continue. He began by observing them from a distance. Each day he walked the streets near the places they gathered, blending in with the neighborhood, making his presence seem ordinary. He noticed how they communicated, small gestures, subtle nods, moments of hesitation that revealed their uncertainty. Even when they tried to act confident in front of others, their nervous energy leaked through. They did not realize that someone had been quietly studying them, understanding their patterns and anticipating their next moves. Back at his apartment, he made small adjustments. Nothing obvious, nothing that would draw attention, but subtle changes that gave him more control over his environment. He checked all the entrances, ensuring every lock worked perfectly. He adjusted furniture to create clear lines of sight and to remove any place where an intruder could hide. He prepared small tools and devices, not weapons in the violent sense, but extensions of his awareness, things that allowed him to monitor movement, detect changes, and maintain control. The gang, meanwhile, became restless. They had expected the man to be afraid, to cower, to call for help. Instead, he had watched, controlled, and reacted subtly, leaving them shaken and uncertain. Their arrogance had been their weakness. They began to test the neighborhood again, looking for easy targets, but their confidence wavered. Every glance at his home reminded them of the unknown, the unseen presence of someone they had underestimated. One evening, he decided it was time to assert control more actively. He did not confront them violently. That was unnecessary. He used intelligence, strategy, and observation to guide his actions. He watched as they moved through the streets, noting the time they spent together, the patterns of their conversations, and the paths they followed. Each step, each gesture, each word became part of the information he stored in his mind. He began to create situations that would subtly disrupt their plans. A small noise in one alleyway caused them to look over their shoulders. A faint shadow across a fence made them hesitate. Every small adjustment, every calculated move was designed to make them uncertain, to make them doubt their own confidence. He did not attack directly. He created a sense of awareness, a feeling that someone was always observing, always prepared. The gang grew frustrated. They whispered among themselves, questioning each other, doubting their own judgment. "Maybe he's watching us all the time," one said. "Maybe he knows what we're doing before we do it." The words were muttered in fear, and their tone carried the weight of unease. They did not understand how accurate that suspicion was. He had been watching, analyzing, and preparing for every eventuality. As the days passed, he continued his careful control. He adjusted cameras and lighting around his home, not to spy or invade, but to detect movement and maintain awareness. He reinforced doors and windows subtly without making them obvious. Every small measure increased his control and decreased the chances of another reckless intrusion. He knew the gang was unpredictable, and unpredictability demanded preparation. One night they attempted another act of intimidation. This time they came closer to his property, whispering, laughing nervously, trying to appear fearless. But he was ready. From a shadowed position he observed them, noting the order of their movements, the way they communicated, the hesitation in their steps. He did not rush. He did not act violently. He allowed them to reveal themselves fully, to expose the weaknesses that had already been documented in his mind. He made small, deliberate interventions. A well-placed reflection of light caused one of them to look away. A subtle sound, barely audible, caused another to stumble slightly. Nothing that would hurt them. Nothing that would escalate unnecessarily, but enough to make them doubt their own actions. The gang began to sense that they were not in control, that they were no longer the predators but the uncertain intruders in a situation they could not dominate. Over time, their behavior changed. They became cautious, hesitant, second-guessing every move. Their usual confidence was replaced with doubt, their arrogance replaced with nervous energy. Even among themselves they whispered constantly, trying to anticipate what might happen next. Every action he had taken, subtle and controlled, had altered their mindset. He had not confronted them with force. He had confronted them with awareness, precision, and strategy. He continued to blend into his daily life. He walked the streets, exchanged greetings, carried out errands, and appeared calm and ordinary. But each movement was intentional, each glance calculated. He never revealed the full extent of his capability, maintaining a quiet dominance that left the gang unsure and hesitant. Every day they felt the invisible presence of someone who was always one step ahead, someone whose patience, intelligence, and skill could not be underestimated. He reflected often on the contrast between their recklessness and his control. They acted out of arrogance, driven by the desire to provoke and intimidate. He acted out of precision, driven by awareness and strategy. The difference was clear, and every subtle disruption, every calculated move reinforced it. They had assumed he would be ordinary, and their mistake had given him control. As the nights passed, the gang began to retreat, both physically and mentally. Their attacks became less frequent, their confidence shaken. Even when they attempted small acts of vandalism or intimidation, they hesitated, unsure if he was aware, unsure if he had already anticipated them. Every pause, every moment of doubt was a victory. He had not used violence. He had used intelligence, strategy, and patience. One evening, he sat quietly in his living room observing the neighborhood. The streets appeared calm, the houses quiet. Yet he remained alert, aware of every sound, every movement. He knew the gang might return, might attempt another act, but he also knew they had learned a crucial lesson. Appearances could be deceiving, and underestimating someone could have consequences they were not prepared for. He took a moment to reflect on his own life, the skills and experiences that allowed him to maintain control in such situations. Years of discipline, awareness, and preparation had taught him the value of patience and observation. He understood that true strength often lay not in immediate action or confrontation, but in control, in intelligence, and in the ability to shape outcomes without exposing oneself unnecessarily. The gang, meanwhile, continued to whisper among themselves, nervous energy still lingering. They could feel that something had changed, that the quiet man they had tried to intimidate was not ordinary. Their movements became more cautious, their plans more hesitant. Even among themselves there was tension and uncertainty, a recognition that they had been outmatched in a way they did not fully understand. He continued his daily routines with calm precision, maintaining the appearance of ordinariness while quietly reinforcing control. Every walk, every glance, every interaction was deliberate, a part of the strategy that kept him prepared and aware. He remained patient, allowing the gang to experience their own growing uncertainty, allowing the tension to build without the need for dramatic confrontation. As the nights went on, the gang's visits decreased. They became cautious, hesitant, unsure of what they would encounter if they returned. Their previous confidence had been replaced by doubt, their arrogance replaced by a lingering fear they could not fully understand. And through it all, he remained calm, controlled, and vigilant, blending into his ordinary life while quietly asserting dominance through intelligence and awareness. He knew that threats could return, that arrogance and hate never disappeared entirely, but he also knew that control, preparation, and awareness were stronger than fear, stronger than brute force. The gang had learned a subtle but powerful lesson. Appearances were deceiving, and underestimating someone could have consequences they could not fully predict. By the time the week had ended, he had regained a sense of calm in his environment. The streets were quiet, the neighbors went about their routines, and the gang had retreated into uncertainty. He continued his daily life with the same measured calm, aware of every sound, every movement, every change. He had not confronted them violently, yet he had achieved control, demonstrating that true power often lay in patience, awareness, and intelligence rather than force. And as he sat quietly in his living room, watching the sunset, he allowed himself a brief smile. The neighborhood remained peaceful on the surface, unaware of the quiet power that had shifted the balance. The gang had learned in their own way that underestimating a calm, aware, and prepared man could lead to consequences they could not anticipate. And he, as always, remained vigilant, ready, and quietly unstoppable. The morning was quiet, deceptively calm. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room floor. He moved through his apartment as usual, brewing coffee, preparing a simple breakfast, checking that everything was in order. On the surface, it seemed like any other day, but inside he was alert, aware, and ready. The previous weeks had taught him that calm could be fragile, that arrogance and hate could return at any moment, and while the neighborhood slept peacefully, the gang's presence still lingered like a dark cloud waiting for the wind to shift. He reflected on the events that had unfolded. Their break-ins, their intimidation, the chaos they had tried to create, all of it had been met with calm observation and subtle control. He had allowed them to see that appearances could be deceiving, that patience and strategy could overpower recklessness and arrogance, and now it was time to bring the situation to its conclusion. Not with anger, not with unnecessary violence, but with precision, intelligence, and control. The gang had grown restless. Their attacks had become cautious, hesitant, and sporadic. Confidence had given way to uncertainty. They had begun whispering rumors in their circles, questioning each other, wondering how a man they thought ordinary could be so controlled and aware. That uncertainty had created cracks in their arrogance, and he intended to widen them. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the neighborhood, he prepared quietly. Every movement was deliberate, every action precise. He checked all doors and windows, adjusted lines of sight, and made subtle changes to the environment to maintain control. These were not drastic measures, but small adjustments that ensured awareness and readiness. He was not preparing for violence. He was preparing to assert dominance and secure justice in a controlled, safe manner. The gang arrived later that night, their usual bravado masking an underlying tension. They approached cautiously, whispering among themselves, their steps hesitant. Something about the house felt different, charged with a presence they could not see but could sense. Their previous confidence was gone, replaced by the uneasy feeling that they were being watched, that someone was aware of every movement they made. He observed them from the shadows, calm and patient. He noted their positions, the way they communicated, the pauses and hesitations that revealed their growing uncertainty. There was no need for rash action. Inexperience and arrogance were powerful enough when properly understood. He allowed them to move, to expose themselves fully, to show exactly what they were willing to do and how far their recklessness could take them. One of the intruders approached a window, peering inside with a mixture of curiosity and boldness. A slight shift in the apartment, a subtle reflection of light and a faint sound made him freeze. He sensed the presence, the awareness of someone watching him. His friends tried to reassure him, but their own uncertainty had begun to spread. Whispers of doubt passed quickly among the group. "I think he's ready for us," one muttered. "Something's not right." From his vantage point, he allowed a moment to build. Patience had been his ally all along. He did not shout. He did not attack. He revealed himself slowly, deliberately, moving into the room where the moonlight caught the edges of his face. His posture, calm yet commanding, radiated control. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. But it was undeniable. The intruders froze. Confidence vanished in an instant. They realized with sudden clarity that they were no longer in control. The man they had tried to intimidate was nothing like what they expected. Calm, precise, and fully aware, he exuded a presence that made hesitation inevitable. Every movement, every word he had spoken over the past weeks had been leading to this moment. And now the truth could not be ignored. "I suggest you leave," he said softly but firmly. There was no need for shouting, no need for threats. His tone carried authority, the kind of authority born from experience, training, and unshakable confidence. The intruders glanced at one another, their fear thinly masked beneath a lingering arrogance. They had underestimated him for too long. Now they realized the danger of that mistake. You're not like anyone else," one of them stammered. What are you?" He allowed a faint smile but said nothing, letting his presence speak for him. In that quiet, charged moment, the reality became clear. He was far beyond their understanding. Their arrogance had blinded them. Their assumptions had been shattered. And the calm man in front of them was not just capable of defending himself. He was prepared, intelligent, and lethal in a way that could not be imagined from appearances alone. The intruders began to retreat, slowly, carefully, as if testing each step. Their usual reckless confidence had been replaced with cautious fear. And still he did not rush, did not provoke. He allowed them to feel the weight of their mistake, to understand that underestimating someone could have consequences beyond their imagination. Every retreating step was a reminder that control was not about violence but about awareness, strategy, and precision. Outside, neighbors watched from windows at a distance, sensing the tension, but not understanding the full story. To them, it appeared that a confrontation had been avoided, that the danger had somehow been diffused. They could not see the subtle mastery of awareness, the quiet control, or the lessons being silently delivered. They only saw the calm that returned to the street, unaware of the invisible shift in power that had taken place. Once the intruders had fully left, he moved through his apartment, inspecting every corner. The damages were minor, their intrusion incomplete, but the lesson had been delivered. He reflected on the events, noting the patterns, the mistakes, and the vulnerabilities they had exposed. Every detail was stored in his mind, a record for the future if needed. This was not about revenge or anger. It was about establishing order, control, and security for himself and his neighborhood. He sat quietly for a moment, sipping his tea, letting the calm settle around him. His mind wandered briefly to the past, the years of training, discipline, and missions that had prepared him for such moments. He had faced far greater dangers in distant lands, situations where lives depended on precision, patience, and awareness. Those experiences had honed his instincts, and now they served him in a way that ensured safety without unnecessary chaos. The gang, meanwhile, retreated into their own circles, whispering among themselves. Their confidence had been broken. Their arrogance had been tested and found wanting. And though they would likely try again someday, the knowledge that the man they had tried to intimidate was not ordinary would linger, a quiet fear that could not be erased. The neighborhood gradually returned to normal, its surface calm, a stark contrast to the tension that had quietly unfolded. Children played in yards, neighbors greeted one another, and life moved forward. Yet beneath the surface, awareness, vigilance, and respect had shifted subtly. The quiet man who brewed coffee, walked streets, and maintained a simple home had demonstrated a lesson in observation, patience, and controlled authority. He returned to his normal routine, but nothing felt ordinary. Every step, every glance, every gesture carried the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered awareness, strategy, and control. He understood that threats could return, that danger could arise and that arrogance often comes without caution. But he was ready. He had the experience, the discipline, and the skill to manage any situation without compromising his values or safety. That night he stood by the window, watching the calm street below. The moonlight reflected softly on the pavement and the air was still. He reflected on the journey of the past weeks, the intimidation, the subtle confrontations, the psychological battle that had unfolded. And he realized that true strength often lies in quiet awareness, in control, and in the ability to influence outcomes without unnecessary force. The gang, somewhere beyond the streetlights, would remember the lessons of those nights. They had underestimated a man who appeared ordinary, but whose life experiences, discipline, and awareness had created a force they could not match. Their arrogance had met precision, their recklessness had met patience, and the balance of power had shifted quietly, irreversibly. He returned to his living room, settled into his chair, and allowed a deep, calm breath to pass through him. The night was peaceful again, but he remained alert, aware, and prepared. He understood that control, patience, and intelligence were his greatest assets. And he also understood that appearances could be deceiving, that ordinary people could hold extraordinary power when experience, discipline, and awareness aligned. And so, life continued. The neighborhood remained calm, unaware of the quiet victories, the subtle lessons, and the controlled authority that had ensured safety and justice. He moved through each day with measured steps, polite greetings, and quiet presence, carrying within him the knowledge and skills that had kept him safe and had taught others a lesson in humility and caution. The surface of life was ordinary, but beneath it lay a depth of awareness, readiness, and intelligence that few could imagine. The quiet man in the simple home had not only defended himself, but had done so with strategy, patience, and moral clarity. And as the sun rose the next morning, he continued his routine, calm, prepared, and quietly unstoppable. The street, the neighbors, and even the gang could see only the calm exterior. They could not see the awareness, the preparedness, or the lessons learned. But he knew, and that knowledge, that mastery of control and understanding was enough. The balance had shifted. Justice had been served not through recklessness, but through precision, intelligence, and quiet authority.